Hi, it's Martin here, and I want to take you on a little tour of what I think are some of the COVID lies, and specifically I want to focus today on the vaccine effectiveness data that was announced by Pfizer earlier on this year. I want to interrogate that data and see if their claims live up to what they're claiming. So there's a big thing about when someone's got a PhD after their name, or someone's got a medical qualification or a scientific qualification, it seems as if whenever that, obviously the great sage has spoken, therefore they speak with credibility. And to a certain extent, I agree with that. But they don't carry 100% of all the credibility on any matter. Many people can investigate these things. I've been in the pharmaceutical industry for 23 years, and I know that there were very good clinicians, very good scientists, but there also were many questionable scientists and many questionable clinicians. So trust me, I'm a doctor is not sufficient. It won't hold water, and we need to interrogate what is actually happening. So the famous Mark Twain is quoted as, there are lies, more lies, and then there are damn statistics. We can make statistic look very good according to what we're trying to achieve. So this is Mr. Albert Bourla, the CEO of Pfizer, earns multiple millions of dollars a year, is on a very, very fat income. And Albert earlier on this year thought he had pulled the rabbit out of the hat, and he's laughing all the way to the bank, earning his multiple millions of salary within an industry that I worked in. And I realized as well, when I worked in that industry, it wasn't even fair within the industry, because the people that did the work on the ground, like myself, making products successful, were not on anywhere near the scale of the salaries of some of these top gods within the organizations. And I'm going to basically demonstrate today that maybe Albert Bourla is telling a few porkies. Okay, this is some of the things that were said earlier on the year about the Pfizer vaccine. So the interim analysis looked at the 94 confirmed cases, the first 94 confirmed cases of COVID-19. So the first thing that I would look at there, that strikes out to me, why 94? Why the first 94? Why not the first 100? Why not the first 200? Why 94? Is 94 more advantageous towards the Pfizer vaccine, which can increase the bias towards the Pfizer vaccine, among more than 43,000 volunteers? So we're talking a lot of people in the study who took the vaccine. Okay, so 43,000 volunteers who took the vaccine. Of those cases, only 10% were among those who had received the vaccine, while 90% of cases were among those who had received a placebo instead. Okay, sounds like, okay, 94, the first 94 cases, 10% of those, which was probably around about 10, developed COVID-19, and 90 developed COVID-19 were on the placebo. But there are questions around that as well, because COVID-19 is a very big area, and the PCR test we know is not completely reliable. It can be up to 90% inaccurate. So what are we talking about here? Secondly, are we talking about this over a whole population? You know, this is, he's making a claim, a very, very big claim of 90% effectiveness based on 94 first confirmed cases out of 43,000 volunteers. I question the 94, and I'm asking why stop at 94? But is that representative of something that is totally beneficial to the whole of mankind? Pfizer said the vaccine, which requires 2 doses, had an efficacy rate higher than 90% at 7 days after the second dose. So here we go. This is where the 90% comes in. Again, at 7 days after the second dose, 90% efficacy rate higher with the Pfizer vaccine. The US Food and Drug Administration said it would require more than 50% efficacy from a vaccine. So what are we actually talking about here? Are we talking symptoms? Are we talking hospitalizations? Are we talking deaths? We're talking, this is a big area here, because if someone naturally acquires a infection, their body will naturally defeat that virus up to 100% of the people. We're talking 99% of people will actually defeat that virus effectively over the whole population. So we're talking here the difference between the first 94 cases and then after 7 days within this particular trial. So Albert Bourla said the vaccine was the greatest medical advance. Emotions are very high. You can imagine how I felt when I heard the results yesterday at 2 p.m. I think that likely based on impact, this will be the greatest medical advance in the last 100 years. A big claim, Albert. Are you the Joker pulling the rabbit out of the hat? Or are you telling porkies? Or are you exaggerating the impact? Well, as the Big Lebowski said, the dude, well, that's just your opinion, man. Okay, this is something that I am very familiar with in the pharmaceutical industry. And this is a gauge that's used very effectively. It's a very good trick that's used to prove the effectiveness of a product in a particular disease area. So relative risk reduction is the actual measurement. And what is the relative risk reduction? This is the control group minus the experimental group over the control group. And this is, for instance, if there's a particular side effect or there's a particular impact with a control group. So it might be, say, it could be asthma. So the incidence of asthmatic attacks on the control group minus the incidence of asthmatic attacks in the event rate over the control event rate. So it's basically comparing the experimental event rate. So that would be maybe the vaccine that you're experimenting with against the control group, and then dividing that by the control event rate. And you might say, oh, that's fair enough because you're actually comparing two groups. But that's called the relative risk reduction. And I'm going to basically show you that that can be a very misleading concept, because there's another measurement called the absolute risk reduction. And on the right-hand side here, it's the control minus the experimental. On the left, you've got relative risk reduction as the control minus the experimental over the control. Whereas absolute risk reduction on the right-hand side is the control minus the experimental. Let's look at a fictitious scenario where the relative risk reduction is very impressive, but the actual outcomes maybe not so impressive. Now, absolute risk reduction is basically looking at the control minus the experimental. So for instance, you may have 3% of the population within a study experiencing a particular impact of asthma, for instance, asthma attack, and then 2% on the experimental experiencing the asthma attack. Now, 3 minus 2 is only 1%. So then you're basically looking at that over the 3. So 1 over 3, and you're talking around about 33% relative risk reduction. So that's quite impressive. But absolute risk reduction, that would be only 1%. So this is a very clever way of improving your statistical significance fictitiously by using relative risk reduction. So here we have two fictitious drugs, okay, that are used in a particular circumstance. So we've got Fixitan at the top, and then we've got Correctopro. They're not actual drugs. Now, the relative risk reduction for Fixitan in this situation is 60%. It's a pretty impressive relative risk reduction. And Correctopro is only 35%. Now, is the 35% more, is it less impressive than the 60%? On the face of it, yes. Well, when you take into consideration absolute risk reduction, which is in the fourth column over, it shows that the absolute risk reduction for Fixatan is only 3%, whereas Correctipro is 14%. So the absolute risk reduction for Correctipro is actually better than that of Fixatan. Now, there's another particular measurement, and it's the numbers needed to treat. And this is why I'm quite impressed with some of the people in evidence-based medicine that have actually looked at the vaccines critically, and they have questioned the veracity of that evidence. And whenever somebody like Bandelier or people that are professionals in evidence-based medicine are questioning the veracity of the efficacy of vaccines, then I listen to that, because whenever I was working in the pharmaceutical industry, there was a lot of emphasis on evidence-based medicine. It wasn't just on the clinical studies and whether those clinical studies were peer-reviewed, and the clinical studies were shown categorically that this medicine was better in this circumstance over another medicine. Whenever Bandelier got into the situation, and they are the experts on evidence-based medicine, and other evidence-based medicines professionals interrogated data within a study, well, then we saw the real evidence being shown and the real efficacy being demonstrated. So, okay, numbers needed to treat in the first study of Fixatan was 33. So it took 33 people to get a clinical outcome that was favorable towards Fixatan, whereas in Correctipro, it took only 6. So on the face of it, relative risk reduction is a very reasonable gauge. It shows that something's very effective. But when you look at it in real life data, based on absolute risk reduction and numbers needed to treat, that doesn't follow through automatically. So the 90% efficacy that's been announced by the likes of Albert Bourla, that doesn't carry water whenever you're talking about absolute risk reduction. We're talking overall population here. You should be talking about the whole 43,000 people, and also talking about specifically real hard figures. So absolute risk reduction and numbers needed to treat. So the two things that I'll be looking at with these vaccines is, number one, what is the numbers needed to treat for each of these vaccines to get a clinical favorable outcome? And then the corollary of that, I would want to know what were the numbers needed to harm. So here are the two calculations, one over the absolute risk reduction for numbers needed to treat, and numbers needed to harm is 1 over the attributable risk. And those figures can be calculated based on the data. So we need to see the data, and we need to carry out these statistical analyses. And that's why evidence-based medicine holds more water than general clinical trials that are published in the medical journals. Whenever you actually interrogate the data, you can see what the impact really is. Now, I want to just look at some quotes from, this is Tess Lowry, and Tess Lowry is an expert in evidence-based medicine. And Tess Lowry has been fairly scathing of the vaccine's credibility, and has been very supportive of the introduction of ivermectin. Now, I'm just gonna go through some of the things that Tess Lowry has basically said. I've looked at the data. This lady has interrogated the data for the vaccines and the veracity of the evidence that has been propagated and the propaganda that has been put out there by the pharmaceutical industry. And I think there is a reason to pause. She says, by the end of June, 300,000 people had reported adverse events through UK regulators' yellow card system after taking the vaccine. And this is not normal. She's basically saying that the yellow card system with 300,000 people showing that there has been some adverse reaction to the vaccine, that this is not a normal situation. If you take a vaccine like tetanus, around since 1968, there are 36 deaths attributed to it on the World Health Organization database, whereas 6,000 to 7,000 deaths have been reported from COVID vaccine in just a few months. Okay, so there's a big difference between 36 deaths and 6,000 to 7,000 deaths. That is a red flag. Number one, we have to take that into consideration. In the UK, there are 1,440 deaths. So this is unprecedented in the history of any medicine. To have so many deaths reported in such a short time, and indeed so many reports in such a short time. This is quite serious. And I've listened to individuals on the radio like Dr. Gabriel Scally basically saying that these vaccines are 100% safe. Well, he wasn't saying they're 100% safe, but he was saying that there's no evidence that they were unsafe in the vast majority of people. Now, this lady, Tess Lowry, has looked at the data, interrogated the data, and I'm not completely sure that Dr. Gabriel Scally has interrogated the data in the same way that Dr. Tess Lowry has. Because he's a public health official and he would say that, wouldn't he? I feel there is a lack of transparency from the regulatory bodies. Now, this is a senior clinician saying, I feel there is a lack of transparency from the regulatory bodies. In their report, they highlight a very rare brain clot, central venous sinus thrombosis, and that there have been 30 deaths associated with this and a couple of hundred cases. But when you look at the yellow card data, you find that there have been 2,208 strokes reported, a brain bleed, and of those, 154 people died. These data are far more worrying to me than just the cerebral venous sinus thrombosis data. And when you look at all sorts of bleed and the cause of death overall, you see that many are associated with bleeding and clotting. We're seeing brain clots and heart clots and lung clots. The commonest causes of death are brain clots, strokes, and then pulmonary embolism, which is a lung clot, and also heart clots, heart attacks. I would like to know more. I personally think that these should be investigated. Now, I listened to Dr. Gabriel Scally on the radio, and he was castigating another clinician, Dr. Anne Tlusky, for her comments in relation to the credibility of the vaccines. And he used the word nonsense many times, and he used these are very safe vaccines, and there's no undue concern for blood clots or any of these conditions or serious conditions, and there's no evidence that any of these deaths that are on the yellow card system have been attributable to the actual vaccines. And this is what he was saying, and I find that amazing that another clinician who is an expert in evidence-based medicine basically looks at the overall impact in terms of yellow cards and raises a red flag and says, you know something, we need to pause. Now, the other aspect of this is another thing in terms of COVID-19. Ivermectin has been castigated, demonized, it's been lambasted and discredited by the main bods and the hierarchy of the health service. And there has an agenda behind this because the evidence is now pretty clear about ivermectin being very effective, especially at the early onset of COVID-19. So Dr. Tess Lowry has looked at the data for ivermectin. Now, all these vaccines are getting approval, but ivermectin's not getting approval. Why? Why is ivermectin not getting approval, and why are all the vaccines getting approval? And this is the comments by Dr. Tess Lowry, and she has said the doctors using ivermectin say you don't get long COVID if you treat with it in the early stages. So if you treat with ivermectin in the early stages of COVID-19, you will not get long COVID, okay? If you've got a treatment for COVID, you don't have to be afraid of COVID. Now, there's two aspects of this. Number one, when we look at the 90%, we know that's based on, that figure is based on not absolute risk reduction. It's based on the fabrication of information that is more positive towards Pfizer with their vaccine. They've looked at a small cohort of 94 people and they've based their 94% around that. We know that natural immunity works in a different way than a vaccine. Whenever you get maybe a virus, you might develop a couple of cough and cold. You might develop a little bit of a flu, but your body is starting to fight against that and building antibodies. Whereas you might use the vaccine and because of the spike protein, it prevents the virus from working. But we're talking about that specific strain. But we're not talking about a overall population here. We're talking about 94 people out of 44,000 subjects. It's not a very good gauge for the whole population. We know that 99% of people will survive COVID-19. 99% of people will be completely okay, and their natural immunity will defeat the virus. Now, the vaccines have been approved based on the first 94 people responding to a vaccine out of 43,000. So this is how the pharmaceutical industry works. It works on data that's highly positive towards the pharmaceutical industry's agenda. I worked in it for 23 years. I know how it operates. Then secondly, we have an effective product that's being banned by the NHS, by all the health services throughout the world. There's some countries that are using it effectively. At the very start of the, what I call now the plandemic or the scamdemic, hydroxychloroquine was castigated, but the evidence now has come out to show that hydroxychloroquine, along with vitamin D, with vitamin C, and with zinc, and an antibiotic, it works. It actually prevents the progression, and it also lessens the impact. So what is going on is the question I would ask here. I would go back again to my friend, Albert Bourla. Albert, are you being completely honest with us? Are you running all the way to the bank, laughing? Have you pulled the rabbit out of the hat? Are you telling little porkies because you know it's going to improve your salary? That's the question I would like to ask. And the other thing that I would like to ask people like Dr. Gabriel Scally, why have you not approved ivermectin? Why have you not approved hydroxychloroquine? These products do work. They've been proven to work. What is your reason for not allowing these products for being used? Anyway, guys, as you can see, I'm quite animated today, and I wanted to make this video really to draw people's attention to how data is manipulated by the pharmaceutical industry, and I hope this has been beneficial to you. Have a good day.